As we approach December 20th and the 200th anniversary of the transfer of Louisiana to the United States, we might be entitled to believe that we know all about the purchase and its aftermath. And yet, the Mellon Symposium that took place here 3 weeks ago demonstrated that new questions have emerged because celebratory discourses on the past have given way to more critical appraisals. Once celebrated, empires are now objects for investigation. Once taken for granted, identities are now questioned, as are issues dealing with memory, individual and collective. Tonight, I would like to focus on some of the questions pertaining to identities and memory related to the purchase, and more specifically to discuss the meanings of the term French Louisiana. Lafayette's 5-day visit to New Orleans in April 1825 was quite an event. The nation's guest was received with extraordinary respect. The Cabildo was chosen to serve as his accommodations and cleaned, repaired, and refurnished for the occasion. A 68-high triumphal arch was built on the Place d'Armes, now Jackson Square, in honor of the revolutionary hero. When the guest of Louisiana made his entry on April 10, 1825, after a stormy steamboat ride from Mobile, pouring rain did not prevent the people of New Orleans to assemble in mass to welcome the great man. Speeches followed, as expected. First, the governor of Louisiana, Henry Johnson. Next, Mayor Joseph Roffignac, a native of France and a royalist who had emigrated to the United States to escape the French Revolution. Last, city recorder Denis Prieur, a white Creole who was to become the mayor of New Orleans in 1828 and serve in this capacity for the next 10 years. There were parades, banquets, balls, and illuminations. Numerous visitors, including members of the Louisiana House of Representatives, a delegation of the Spanish residents of the city, former revolutionary officers and soldiers, the Saint-Domingue-born Bishop of New Orleans, Louis-Guillaume Valentin Dubourg, the colorful Father Antonio Sedella of St. Louis Cathedral, a delegation of the former Free Colored Militia, and a deputation of Freemasons, numerous visitors indeed, who called on Lafayette to pay their respects. When the great man left the city on April 15, an immense crowd took him from the Cabildo through short streets to the river and the steamboat Natchez, which was to carry the general to St. Louis. Similar celebrations took place elsewhere in the U.S. during Lafayette's grand tour, but in New Orleans, they took a meaning of their own. Not only did they serve, as elsewhere, as a symbol of national unity, not only did they suggest the legitimacy of Louisiana's place within the nation, they also signaled the presence in New Orleans of a vibrant French culture for all to see. As Governor Johnson reminded his guests, quote, "You will find in Louisiana one subject of consolation and delight which no other part of the United States can present to you. This state, settled by Frenchmen and principally inhabited by their descendants, enjoys as a member of the American Confederacy the full measures of that liberty for which you toiled and bled. And the wise and temperate use of which Frenchmen have here made use of that liberty is a triumphant answer to those who have proclaimed them unfit for freedom." Lafayette did not miss the point. He forcefully agreed that Louisiana gave a daily evidence of, I quote him, "the fitness of the French population for a wise use of the blessings of French institutions and self-government." Something he did not need to add that was denied to the French during the Bourbon Restoration as it had been during the Napoleonic Empire. Lafayette and the various orators repeatedly emphasized the French character of New Orleans. To Mayor Roffignac's address, Lafayette replied that he had always hoped that his Louisiana countrymen might someday participate in the benefits of Republican liberty and independence. On behalf of the marshals that superintended the general's reception, Jean-François Canonge, another Saint-Domingue refugee who had come to Louisiana by way of Cuba in 1809, insisted that New Orleans, I quote him, was composed both of men proud of claiming their birth from your ancestors and of citizens in whose cause you have so valiantly fought. During the reception and banquet given by the Masons on April 14, the American Grand Master, John Henry Holland, noted in his welcoming address that he ought to have spoken English, his native language, but had thought that it might be pleasing to Lafayette, in a country inhabited by so many citizens of French origin, to hear the assurance of the love of America in that language. As many participants in the 1825 celebration suggested at the time, the French character of New Orleans and much of Louisiana was well established by the 1820s. Indeed, so much so that its historic, time-specific dimension was lost on contemporaries and later historians alike. In their descriptions, comments, and narratives, Louisiana had become French while a colony of France. It had remained French while a colony of Spain, and it retained its French traits since the purchase. It was so French indeed that when Judge Charles Gaillaret published his Histoire de la Louisiane in 1846, he pointed out as an introduction that he would have to publish later an American translation of his work that would be quite different from the French original, and indeed, the introductions to both editions, the French and the American one, are quite different in style and content. Well, I would like to tell tonight a different story, one that does not take for granted the timeless French character of Louisiana. I contend that Louisiana was constructed as French mostly after it became American, after 1803. I argue that the definitions, meanings, and contents of this French character have always been, since 1803, a matter of cultural and political debate and disagreement, with three different configurations or regimes emerging in succession. First, before the Civil War, second in the late 19th and early 20th century, and finally in the second half of the 20th century. But let me first briefly discuss the situation before 1803, when Louisiana was not French, but was a Creole colony. The indisputable fact that Louisiana was a colony of France until it was ceded to Spain in the 1760s did not necessarily make it French in cultural and social terms. Granted, there were French colonial administrators and soldiers in Louisiana. Granted, all colonists were the king's subjects, and the colony, after all, was named after Louis XIV. But 18th century metropolitan Frenchmen who heard about Louisiana were likely to associate the colony either with the infamous Mississippi bubble that burst in January 1720, or with the deportation of convicts made famous in Prévost's 1733 novel, Manon Lescaut. Others saw it as a frontier area that provided interactions with Indians, as Lepage Duprat suggested in his 1758 Histoire de la Louisiane. On the whole, Louisiana spoke little to the French imagination, far less than the Sugar Islands, in particular Saint-Domingue. French diplomats were no more likely than ordinary Frenchmen to invest the colony of Louisiana with favorable cultural meanings at the time, nor indeed to invest much in it at all. 18th century French colonial policy was premised on the idea that colonies had to be useful to French commerce, providing the metropolis with products it needed. Louisiana failed on all counts. Its importance was strategic, as a buffer against Anglo-American incursions into the Mississippi Valley. On the whole, Louisiana mattered far less to French policymakers than the West Indies, colonies that were extremely rich and did provide France with products it did not have. And it is little wonder, therefore, that when France lost the war for North America, the French managed to keep its Sugar Islands and relinquish French sovereignty over Louisiana to Spain. It was also a cultural decision in a sense. Cap Français on Saint-Domingue was a bustling, if unruly, colonial city in the 1750s and 60s, the great French metropolis of the Americas. a cosmopolitan center that boasted a cultural life financed by the rapidly growing plantation economy. A large part of France's trade was based on Saint-Domingue's sugar, coffee, and indigo. By the late 1780s, before the Revolution, Cap Français had a population of almost 19,000 people, as much as Boston in 1770. In contrast, New Orleans was a small town of fewer people, resources, and promises. And the cession of Louisiana to Spain in 1762-63 and the subsequent revolt of Franco-Louisianian colonists against the Spanish governor in 1768 allow us to assess the views of French Louisiana held by Louisianians themselves. When the news of the cession reached Louisiana in late 1764, Louisianians reacted with fear that Spanish mercantilism would prevent thereafter Louisiana commerce with France, and they wrote to Paris to protest. And likewise, after the revolt of 1768, colonists wrote letters and memoirs and sent delegates to France requesting the restoration of French sovereignty. And yet, the idea that Louisianians felt strongly French at the time should be handled with care. Colonists revolted in 1768 when they learned that the King of Spain had issued a decree forbidding trade with France and suggesting that the Spaniards had decided to become more active in their new colony's affairs, something the colonies resented. A good case can be made, therefore, that the revolt had economic rather than patriotic causes, and that the subsequent appeal to the French was an attempt to protect the insurgents from Spanish reprisals. As is well known, the French authorities were embarrassed by the revolt. The French commissioner in New Orleans was ordered to give the name of the revolt's leaders to the Spaniards, and several were executed as a result. France's greatest fear was the fall of Louisiana into British hands, and they made sure the colony would remain under Spanish authority. Given France's unsupportive attitude in 1768, Louisianians had little reason to cultivate good feelings towards monarchical France over the following 2 decades. Spain's repression of the revolt soon gave way to commercial and demographic policies that suggested that the Spanish were more interested in Louisiana than the French had ever been. As a consequence, the colony and its capital experienced significant growth during the Spanish period. Likewise, the French Revolution did not create new loyalties toward France. There were, to be sure, some French Republicans and Jacobins in Louisiana, but their number and role remained limited. The news of the beheading of Louis XVI in 1793 encouraged some to petition the French Convention to restore French rule, and the Spanish governor Carondelet was greatly alarmed by reports of the Marseillaise being sung at the theater. And yet, many other Louisianians strongly opposed revolutionary ideas, particularly after the French abolition of slavery. When Citizen Genet saw fit to send a pamphlet from Philadelphia from the freemen of France to their brothers in Louisiana, assuring the Frenchmen of Louisiana that you still love your mother country and encouraging them to revolt, the agitation was limited to a few more Marseillaises and Carmagnoles, and by January 1794, the ever-worried Carondelet could report to Madrid that Louisiana was quiet and Genet's maneuvers a failure. In fact, the events in Saint-Domingue in the early 1790s, culminating in the slave revolt, came to play a defining role in Louisianian perceptions of the pros and cons of the revolutionary agitation and of local attitudes towards France and French culture. In its first phase, the Saint-Domingue agitation stimulated the ambitions of free Louisianians of colors like Pierre Bailly, who demonstrated on several occasions a commitment to republicanism that antagonized Spanish authorities. In its second phase, the slave insurrection, the war, and the departure of thousands of Dominions, particularly in 1793 and 1803, it may have sent a message of hope to many slaves in Louisiana. But it also terrorized white Louisianians, as well as some free persons of colors, throughout the 1790s and early 1800s. Saint-Domingue became central to individual and collective memories and consciousness. In other words, the reference to France during the French and Spanish period was contradictory. Monarchical France had largely been indifferent to its colony and colonists, while revolutionary France symbolized social disorder and economic disaster for most white Louisianians. What developed in 18th century Louisiana, therefore, was a local variation on a well-known theme and process in both the British and Spanish colonies of America and French Saint-Domingue, creolization, or the development of l'esprit colon. At the same time that French nationalists were inventing a cult of the nation as a project for metropolitan France, as David Bell has recently argued, many Louisianians developed a specific Creole identity and began to refer to themselves in French or in Spanish as Louisianais or habitants de la Louisiane, not Frenchmen. Acadian refugees who had recently arrived from Acadia and the errants in the Atlantic world, including for some an attempt to return to France that proved a drastic failure, Acadians who had settled in isolated areas of prairie and bayou Louisiana experienced a similar process in the late 18th century. They, too, did not evoke a direct relation to France, and they developed local identities and cultures. So how did Louisiana become French? Well, the idea that Louisiana was and always been French became important in the very first years of the 19th century for a series of reasons. First, the retrocession of Louisiana to France forced French partisans of the recreation of a French empire in North America and the West Indies to articulate a role for Louisiana in their colonial grand design. Admittedly, the empire center would remain Saint-Domingue after the island had been recaptured and slavery reinstated. Louisiana, however, was given an importance it never had before 1762. The new colonial prefect, Pierre-Clément Lossat, was ordered to insist that Louisiana was dear to the French government and part of French history. Lossat visibly took his orders to heart. When he arrived in New Orleans in late March 1803, he was convinced that, I quote him, all Louisianians are Frenchmen at heart, an interesting distinction in itself. And he issued a proclamation that emphatically said so. This new vision of Louisiana by French government officials originated in part in a number of pamphlets, reports, and travel narratives that were published at the time, for instance, by Joseph Pontalba of New Orleans, who submitted a memoir on Louisiana insisting that it is with enthusiasm that Louisianians would again become French if they had no apprehensions as to the organization to be established among them in relation to the blacks, whose emancipation would destroy the fortune of all, annihilate all the means of existence, and be the presage of the greatest misfortune, Saint-Domingue again. The new doctrine took on a different meaning when Bonaparte decided to sell the colony to the U.S. A return to France's earlier policy of avoiding potential British control over Louisiana at all costs, and was the one that was motivated by the first consul's pragmatic evaluation of the situation, the disaster of the French expedition in Saint-Domingue, the sorry state of the French Navy, President Jefferson's firm statements on Louisiana to the French chargé d'affaires in Washington, and finally the expectation of a forthcoming war in Europe. Lossat's new orders, which he received disbelievingly in August 1803, informed him of the sale of Louisiana and instructed him again to emphasize France's and Bonaparte's good feelings towards Louisianians. In French official rhetoric, the Louisianais became symbols of a new French-American political relation only a few years after the quasi-war and a few months after the tension that led to the purchase. On the day of the transfer of sovereignty from Spain to France, November 30th, 1803, Lossat issued a proclamation insisting that for the U.S. and France, Louisianians would become I quote him, "The beloved pledge of friendship between the two republics, which cannot fail to grow stronger every day and will contribute so powerfully to their common peace and prosperity," unquote. If only rhetorically, Louisiana was invested thereafter with a symbolic function that had never existed during the 18th century. French officials realized that unlike the cession of 1762-63, the sale of 1803 was for good, and they developed a cultural and memorial argument to preserve the future. The power of symbols notwithstanding, it is doubtful that the creation of a lasting French significance for Louisiana would have amounted to much had the notion not taken a life of its own immediately in the view of many American officials. The notion that Louisiana was French had never been a matter of discussion in American official circles before the purchase. But now that Louisiana had become American, ethnicity became an issue. Claiborne and other officials quickly understood its complex nature and made much of what they perceived as the complex and potentially dangerous French identity of the new American possessions, thereby contributing to the idea that Louisiana had always been French. In a letter to Madison in early 1804, Claiborne called all French-speaking Louisianians French officers and citizens, or Frenchmen. He well knew the difference, however, between Frenchmen and Creoles. The first ones were soldiers and sailors, he wrote. As well, I quote him, as between 20 and 30 young adventurers from Bordeaux and San Domingo who are troublesome to this society, there are men of desperate fortunes, inflated with the idea of the invincibility of Bonaparte and the power of the French nation. They feel mortified at the possession of this province by the U.S., and they seem determined to sour the inhabitants as much as possible with the American government." Unquote. These inhabitants were the Creoles of the country, whose language, manners, and habits here were French, but they were not Frenchmen, even if Claiborne thought that many years will elapse before the strong partiality of the Louisianians for their mother country will be effaced. Claiborne's relative ability to sort out the various types of French-speaking individuals in Louisiana was not shared by all Americans. A characterization of New Orleans residents sent by James Wilkinson to Jefferson in July 1804 called several Creoles Frenchmen. James Pitot was said to think the French the first of nation, and himself the first Frenchman. Pierre d'Herbigny was much attached to his native country. Etienne Boré, principally distinguished by his vanity and a blind attachment to the French nation. And likewise, the first postmaster, John Gurley, repeatedly mentioned French citizens and French inhabitants in a letter to the Postmaster General. While American officials were discovering that Louisiana was French, white Louisianians still emphasized their Creole identity. They understood that the new context created by the purchase caused new worries, created new opportunities, and allowed new cultural strategies. The substitution of a geographically and politically proximate American regime to a more distant Spanish government contributed to encouraging them to make new claims in order to reinforce their position vis-à-vis their new government and built on French cultural prestige at the time for their own interests. Within a year of the transfer of Louisiana to the U.S., two pamphlets emphasized Louisianian identity and demands, a memorial presented by the inhabitants of Louisiana to the Congress of the U.S., and a pamphlet on the political situation of Louisiana published by a Louisianais, as he signed it. Both are in Jones Hall. The post-purchase construction of Louisiana as a culturally French region built on the visions and conceptions developed between 1800 and 1804. It was a contradictory process that involved many different actors and was clearly inscribed in time and space. In geographical terms, the space of the new French Louisiana was increasingly reduced in a growingly American environment. The new meaning did not apply to the regions of colonial Greater Louisiana that had not become part of the new territory of Orleans, later state of Louisiana. And within this latter entity, it applied mostly to New Orleans. and to a lesser extent to commercial towns like Donaldsonville. In other words, it largely excluded the areas settled by Acadians who continued to develop their own cultural and economic patterns during the 19th century. Making Louisiana French would not have been possible without the influx of Gallic newcomers. Many of them, in turn, would not have settled in Louisiana had they not felt they were relocating to a culturally French territory. This was true of some Saint-Domingue refugees as well, particularly as of later migrants from France. A few of those who left Saint-Domingue during the 1790s and early 1800s went directly to Spanish New Orleans, but the majority did not, instead relocating to Cuba, Jamaica, or the American cities of Charleston and Philadelphia. But the refugees' expulsion from Cuba after Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 brought them to American New Orleans. Some 9,000 white, free-colored, and slave refugees who arrived between May 1809 and January 1810, almost doubling the city's population and giving new meanings to the city's French traits. The Saint-Domingue refugees were actually a mixed crowd, not only because the 1809 included about a third white, one-third free people of color, and one-third slaves, but also in social terms. Next to former Grands Blancs who had left behind their plantation, there were numerous Petits Blancs, artisans, shopkeepers, merchants, etc., who had migrated from France to Saint-Domingue in the 3 decades before the Revolution, hoping to, and sometimes succeeding in, becoming wealthy. Marie Santon, for instance, whose papers are here at Jones' collection, the daughter of a master silk dyer in Lyon, moved to Saint-Domingue in the 1780s, and she opened a perfume shop in Cap Français. She escaped to Cuba in 1803 with her recent husband, Jean Augustin, the son of a notary of Chinon, who had moved to Saint-Domingue also in the 1780s. Both left Cuba for New Orleans in 1809. Jean-Baptiste Fontaine was no aristocrat either. Born in Paris in 1745 in a family of artisans and shopkeepers, he moved to Saint-Domingue in 1774, and for the next 20 years tried his hand at many occupations, being successively a baker, a shopkeeper, an employee, and a small planter. When he fled Saint-Domingue for Baltimore in the summer of 1793, along with a certain Louis Tulane, he had become a rich man who owned 45 slaves, although he lost everything in the Revolution. At some point in the late 1790s, he relocated to New Orleans and rebuilt his fortune there. Men and women like Marie Santon, Jean-Baptiste Fontaine, or Jean Augustin brought to New Orleans their experiences and identities of French natives, immigrants to Saint-Domingue, participants in the slave economy, and Saint-Domingue refugee, not to mention their experience in Cuba. Migrants from France also contributed to the cultural construction of Louisiana as French. During the 1790s, New Orleans, unlike Philadelphia, had not been a major destination for the émigrés who escaped revolutionary France. But in the new post-purchase context, the establishment and then the fall of the empire and the royalist restoration in France made New Orleans an attractive destination for French Republicans and Bonapartists. And more importantly, it became a favorite magnet to thousands of French men and women who chose to leave their country and look for a better life in the U.S. during the antebellum period. To French immigrants in the 30s and 40s, Louisiana seemed as close culturally as their 2 favorite destinations in Latin America, Buenos Aires and Montevideo, and much closer than New York City. And moreover, Louisiana was a springboard for further migrations to Texas and Mexico. At one level, the making of French Louisiana was a private and daily endeavor. Many New Orleanians of Gallic origin maintained lively personal ties with France throughout the period under consideration. Saint-Domingue refugees wrote to France about possible compensation for their losses on the island, and many communicated with their relatives in France. Immigrants from France, then called foreign French, wrote and received similar letters. Ties with France were not limited to upper-class Louisiana families who sent their sons to France for educational purposes. They mattered to many immigrants of various social and economic standing. And beyond official events like Lafayette's visit, the public making of French Louisiana was a daily occurrence. It was demonstrated in the visibility of French artisans like the cabinet makers Seigneuret and Mallard, or the bookstore owner Boimard, all of whom worked in a largely Gallic world, unlike their compatriots who had chosen to settle in New York rather than New Orleans. Boimard, for instance, arrived in New Orleans in the early 1820s, and he participated in the growth of a network of Gallic cultural institutions in New Orleans: bookstores, reading cabinets, literary coffee houses, libraries. Not only did Boimard's shop on Chartres Street sell books by the most recent French authors, like Victor Hugo or Honoré de Balzac, but Boimard edited a literary magazine, and he published books that contributed to New Orleans' French culture, like textbooks in French for school children, or a catechism of La Louisiane in the late 1820s. He returned to France in the mid-1840s, but he maintained his ties to Louisiana. He published the first bibliography of Louisiana history in Paris in 1853, and his children chose to return to New Orleans to run a bookstore like their father. Thanks to Boimard and many others, Gallic culture in antebellum New Orleans was lively and diverse to an astonishing extent. It was neither hegemonic nor united, however. Its domination was constantly challenged by alternative cultural models proposed by Americans and immigrants from other European countries. And yet, until the Civil War, Gallic culture was socially and spatially present in New Orleans and several Louisiana towns to an extent unknown anywhere else in the Americas. New Orleans had many literary and political and commercial French newspapers and magazines in the 40s and 50s. Some catered to a particular constituency, like Freemason for Le Franc-Maçon Louisianais, or theater goers for La Lorgnette, Revue de Théâtre, Courrier des Salons, Journal des Artistes. Many were short-lived, but their fate did not prevent Louisiana French-speaking journalists to launch new papers or review. According to one account, between 1840 and 50, 33 new French journals were started in New Orleans and 17 in the parishes. Donaldsonville, for instance, was a town of 1,500 in the 1840s, with several French-language newspapers: L'Ami des Planteurs, La Gazette de la Fourche, and above all, Le Vigilant, all part of a network of French-language newspapers that covered many towns in Louisiana. Not to mention Donaldsonville's French cafes, restaurants, theaters, and two militia companies, les Canonniers and les Chasseurs. And the diversity of Gallic culture was no less striking than its visibility. Class, race, and gender combined to split Gallic New Orleans into many discrete segments. Best known is the high culture of New Orleans' white Gallic elites, but no less important were the middle-class culture of white artisans, shopkeepers, and businessmen, men and women, about whom we still know very little. In many respects, race played a central role within New Orleans' French culture. In racial terms, colonial and antebellum Louisiana was a three-tiered society, organized along the distinction between whites, free persons of colors, and slaves. Free persons of colors had been present in Louisiana long before the purchase, and many others had arrived in 1809 from Cuba and Saint-Domingue. They knew they had nothing to gain from the implementation of an American racial order that would deprive them of their freedom and status, and they defended both during the antebellum period, losing some of the battle they fought. The free-colored militia that had served during the Spanish regime as a means of upward mobility disappeared, despite its demonstration of loyalty to the United States during the Battle of New Orleans. Even more threatening for free people of color was the process of legal containment and then rollback that began immediately after the purchase and went on until the Civil War. This context encouraged free persons of color to turn their attention to cultural battles, to make use of French culture and references, and to take advantage of the particular profile of New Orleans society in a subtle strategy to fight the American racial order. To carve a space for themselves and to resist the pressure of American conformity was one of the goals of the free-colored writers and poets published in Armand Lanus's 1845 anthology, Les Senelles. Born in New Orleans in 1812, Lanus became a publicist and propagandist of Afro-Creole culture. He was active in the publication in 1843 of a literary magazine to which contributed free men of color. And in 1845, he wrote the introduction to Les Sonnelles. In the 1850s, he was an educator, serving as director of the Catholic Institution for Orphans until the Civil War. French Romanticism pervaded the pages of Les Sonnelles, arguably the best French poetry in North America in the 19th century. Its contributors shared even the ambiguity of French Romantic writers towards Napoleon. While Victor Séjour celebrated the cult of the emperor, Manuel Silla reminded his readers that Bonaparte had attempted to reinstate slavery in Saint-Domingue. Other free persons of color chose to emphasize French language religious institutions, like Henriette de Lille, Sisters of the Holy Family, who gave a feminine face to Afro-Catholicism, as Emily Clark and Virginia Gould have so convincingly argued. And yet others turned to educational institutions to resist American pressures, while others joined Masonic societies or political clubs where they elaborated languages and discourses strongly influenced by French republicanism. Clearly, there was never a unanimity on the meanings of the reference to France in antebellum New Orleans. In a sense, it was one of the few places outside France where revolutionary struggles went on during the 19th century as they did in metropolitan France, as my colleague Francois Weil used to argue. In its diversity, New Orleans' French language press testified to the coexistence or parallel presence of Republican, Napoleonic, and Royalist leaderships in New Orleans. And this diversity fueled Gallic cultural growth in the larger context of the city's impressive economic, demographic, and spatial antebellum expansion. The city did become more American as time went by, but the weight of its French component remained heavy until the late 50s, in part because economic growth stimulated further migration from France. However, French culture in New Orleans was increasingly on the defensive in the 1850s because Gallic Louisianians were being outnumbered by the addition of American, Irish, and German immigrants. As one result, cultural constructions of Franco-Louisianian identities lost some of their most lively content. Some Gallic Louisianians sought refuge in more intellectual pursuits. It is not surprising that it is during that period that authors such as Charles Gaillaret published the first nostalgic historical narratives of the French colonial period. And as another result, some French Louisianians, like Gaillaret himself, supported the American Party and Know-Nothingism in the early 1850s, targeting Irish immigrants in order to break the Irish-German-American alliance that put them, the French, the Creoles, in the political minority. Last, many Gallic New Orleanians, and tellingly their newspaper was entitled La Renaissance Louisianaise, Louisianian Rebirth, fought on the Confederate side during the Civil War, in part because this was, in their opinion, the best way to resist the imposition of an American cultural order in New Orleans, and in part because they had become Southerners between the 1820s and the 1860s. Confederate defeat led these same individuals, men like Gaillaret, or the painter Edgar Degas' uncle, Michel Musson, whose papers, incredibly rich paper, are here at Jones Library, or the editor of the racist and satirical weekly Reconstruction newspaper, Le Carillon, led these individuals to redefine their goals in racial terms, to identify French culture with white Creole purity, and to advocate a white-only, mythically French, and increasingly narrow culture. The free persons of color were no less on the defensive than the white supremacists, and they too lost on many counts. Free-colored leaders decided to bet on the northern side and hoped that radical reconstruction would guarantee their status and their leadership position vis-à-vis both white Louisianians and the freedmen. Louis Roudanez, a physician whose family came from Saint-Domingue, launched L'Union, a newspaper, in 1862, followed by the Tribune de la Nouvelle-Orléans in 1864. But when Reconstruction ended, their hopes for equality had been dashed. The meaning of French Louisiana evolved once again after Reconstruction because of major structural and social changes. Migration from France became negligible as potential immigrants took into consideration the economic situation in Louisiana and chose instead Argentina, California, or New York. The absence of new immigrant arrivals reinforced the defensiveness and growing isolation of white Franco-Louisianians. As New Orleans became an American city, its streets and shops lost much of its daily Gallic flavor. French culture, as a result, became less of an everyday occurrence and more of an intellectual and political project. The number of French newspapers and periodicals fell dramatically from 16 during the 1870s to 7 in the 1890s to 2 in the 1900s. There were, to be sure, elite attempts to defend white Creole culture, such as the creation in 1875 of a new cultural society, l'Athénée Louisianais, which hoped to encourage the use of the French language and the resistance of French culture. And the period also saw the development of a body of racialized literature on the white Creoles that mythified their experiences and history, including Alfred Mercier's novel or Charles Gaillaret's 1885 Tulane lecture, The Creoles of History and the Creoles of Romance. By the turn of the century, indeed, white Gallic culture in New Orleans belonged to the realm of nostalgia and romantic historical reconstruction, as suggested by the funerals of Charles Gaillaret in an empty St. Louis cathedral in 1895. There were, to be sure, efforts to revive the Creole, the white Creole vision of French Louisiana, and most important was those of Professor Alcée Fortier of Tulane University, a white Creole who developed a subtle cultural construction that proclaimed an ethno-racial solidarity between the white Creoles, the Acadians, whom he rediscovered, and the French, whose cultural prestige Fortier deemed useful for the rejuvenation of the notion of French Louisiana. Fortier's ambitious project led him to write an important history of Louisiana, to become the president of numerous organizations, including the French Alliance of the United States and Canada, the American Folklore Society, and the Louisiana Historical Society, and to mastermind the 1903 pageant organized for the Louisiana Purchase Centennial. As you may know, he decided to act the part of Prefect Lossa for the occasion. This December 20, 1903 pageant lends itself to useful and final discussion of the contemporary meanings of the notion of French Louisiana and its evolution throughout the 20th century. First, its Fortieresque emphasis on a highly hierarchized French race composed of elite white Creoles and lower-class Acadians did not survive Fortier, who died in 1814. And after him, white Creole Louisiana did not disappear, but outside of a few elite, some say secretive, and increasingly narrow circles in New Orleans, it remained only a literary, at times mythical or picturesque topic. During the 1920s and 1930s, it greatly benefited from the efforts of the writer Lai Saxon, who reinvented the Gallic meaning for New Orleans Vieux Carré and began a movement for the rejuvenation of a notion of French Louisiana premised on heritage and tourism. Second, conspicuously absent from the 1903 pageant was one major strain of 19th century Franco-Louisianian culture, the alternative vision of French Louisiana, which the free persons of color had defended until the end of Reconstruction. In fact, its absence was a testimony to the power of segregation at the time, but it did not mean that the Afro-Creoles had lost for good the various battles they had waged in the previous decades. Certainly, they had been visible in Louisiana in the 1890s, when the Afro-Creoles Citizens Committee had launched the famous Plessy case that led to the Supreme Court infamous 1896 decision. Although Afro-Creoles were excluded from the 1903 pageant, they used a preserved consciousness of their cultural heritage to maintain a distinct identity well into the 20th century, as illustrated by the example of the New Orleans Creole writer Rodolphe Lucien Desdunes, the authors in 1911 of an important essay on Gallic Creoles of color, Our Men and Our History, published in Montreal. And since the civil rights movement and the end of segregation, Afro-Creole culture has returned to the forefront once again, and it is today the central component of Louisiana's so-called French heritage. French Louisiana is now, in part, Afro-Creole Louisiana. Third, very discreet in 1903, was the Acadian or Cajun presence, although Fortier had invented Acadian studies and paved the way for what Cécile Trépanier has aptly called the future Cajunization of French Louisiana. It is not surprising that Cajuns had been given little space at the 1903 celebration, given the fact that but for Fortier's admittedly patronizing interest, negative outside stereotypes of Cajun culture were more powerful at the time than a positive internal ethnic elaboration or consciousness. Fortier's effort, however, did result in partly rehabilitating Cajun language and culture, and including them in a larger vision of Francophone Louisiana in stark contrast with the earlier situation when a relatively autonomous Cajun culture and identity had little to do with the various uses of French Louisiana that had developed in New Orleans and other urban areas in Louisiana. In the decades after 1903, and particularly since the 1960s and 70s, the transformation that Cajun culture experienced from within have led to the contemporary reinvention of French Louisiana as, in part, Cajun Louisiana. Almost 2 centuries after Pierre-Clément Laussat transferred Louisiana to William Claiborne and James Wilkinson, and a century after Alcée Fortier reenacted that ceremony, we know now that the Louisiana Purchase, or sale, from my point of view, created new cultural encounters and possibilities. The Purchase did not make Louisiana French, but it made it possible for various individuals and groups in Louisiana since 1803 to debate, dream, fight, or disagree about culture, identity, and an idea, French Louisiana, that has held multiple and contradictory meanings ever since, until the Afro-Creole and Cajun paradigm we know today. It is these individuals and these groups who made Louisiana French. Thank you.